If I could just take a moment and I had an assignment the other day. Someone asked me to write a letter for a time capsule that is going to be opened in Los Angeles 100 years from now. We live in a world in which the great powers have poised and aimed at each other horrible missiles of destruction, nuclear weapons that can in a matter of minutes arrive in each other's country and destroy virtually the civilized world we live in. And suddenly it dawned on me, those who would read this letter 100 years from now will know whether those missiles were fired. They will know whether we met our challenge, whether they have the freedoms that we have known up until now will depend on what we do here. Mr. President.
Among the many thousands of details collected by the KGB regarding Ronald Reagan prior to and during his presidency, one phrase is most profound. Noted in the year leading up to Reagan's election as the 40th U.S. president, one Soviet agent observed that his word and deed are one and the same. As president, Reagan brought sweeping changes in defense spending, diplomacy, and psyche that altered the face of U.S.-Soviet relations.
His imagining a world without communism, it was imagination. No one else thought that within 10 years of Reagan becoming president, the Warsaw Pact was going to dissolve and its members were going to start to ask for membership in NATO. And I mean, it was literally a triumph of imagination.
By taking a stand against communism, Ronald Reagan hastened the death of the Soviet Union and the close of the Cold War. In 1947, director of the Screen Actors Guild Ronald Reagan testified as a friendly witness at the controversial House Un-American Activities Committee hearings. As director of the Guild, he received so many threats from those he believed to be subversives that Warner Brothers Studios acquired a gun license and bought him a pistol. After realizing his political ambitions and becoming governor of California in the late 60s, he received further intimidation. Whether the danger was the work of socialists or not, to Ronald Reagan, communism had become a real and personal peril. Taking advantage of Jimmy Carter's inability to solve the Iran hostage situation or the weak economy, Reagan was able to win the 1980 presidential election handily. The looming might of the Soviet military force and humiliation of the hostage crisis had Americans feeling vulnerable in the Cold War. The new president brought an overwhelming amount of patriotism to the White House, portraying the Soviet Union as an evil empire and the U.S. as a shining city upon a hill. Even worse than low morale, however, was an inadequate military force. Under Carter's détente policy, America had fallen behind the Soviet Union by $50 billion in annual defense spending.
The United States is no longer the first military power on earth.
As president, Reagan made quick work to change this. In his first 2 weeks in office, he approved a defense budget increase of $32 billion, and by the time he would leave office 8 years later, he would increase the budget from $126 billion to $312 billion a year. Rather than accepting disingenuous guarantees of fewer weapons, he wanted to challenge the Soviet Union to build even more weapons than ever before. His extreme amount of military spending may have made him seem like a boorish warmonger to political opponents of the time, but it effectively began to force the enemy's hand. A nation whose economy was never truly secure, the USSR was pressured to match America's arms production. In 1981, Politburo approved a 5-year, 45% increase in defense spending, and during Reagan's first term alone, the percentage of the Soviet GNP allotted to the military rose to 27%. Reagan had understood for years that the Soviet system was crumbling under its own weight and wanted to accelerate the process. In an interview with the Washington Post as far back as 1963, he acknowledged that there was every indication and every reason to believe that the Soviet Union can no longer increase its production of arms, and it would be of great benefit to the U.S. if we started a build-up. The Soviet Union was strained far more severely in Reagan's first term than it had been in years previously. When General Secretary Konstantin Chernenko died just 48 days into Reagan's second term, many Soviets recognized the necessity to change. Alexander Yakovlev, the foremost proponent of the glasnost policy, declared, "We cannot live like this any longer." If conditions in the USSR looked bleak prior to 1980, there was certainly no room for improvement in the years that followed. Reagan's stand on communism forced the Soviet Union to adapt, and they did so by selecting the radically different Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was more open to Western ideas than previous general secretaries, loosening the government's grip on the press and meeting with Ronald Reagan personally 5 times, the most by any combination of American and Soviet leaders. In their many famous meetings, the two sparred frequently on one central topic, Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, or, as the press sarcastically dubbed it, Star Wars.
Let me share with you a vision of the future which offers hope. It is that we embark on a program to counter the awesome Soviet missile threat with measures that are defensive.
1982's defense guideline had requested the development of weapons that are difficult for the Soviets to counter, impose disproportionate costs, open up new areas for military competition, and obsolesce previous Soviet investment. These ideas came to include the politically risky Strategic Defense Initiative, the concept of a multi-layered anti-missile system far above Earth's surface, composed of microwave rays and laser beams. The plan had been picked apart by the press. Time magazine referred to it as video game vision. The New York Times called it sophisticated nonsense. Scientists agreed, many declaring that even a 99.9% effective defense shield would not be possible in a 20-year time frame. Despite criticism, SDI became a more serious issue in October of 1986 at the Reykjavik summit. Gorbachev was adamantly against the SDI program because of the cost of trying to keep pace with American technology, as well as its possible first strike implications, and he refused to agree to the proposals put forth at the summit without its elimination. As Gorbachev himself said, "We are stealing everything from the people and turning this country into a military camp. They are counting on our military exhaustion, and they are trying to pull us in on the SDI." Gorbachev's appeals, however, were ignored. Reagan's stubborn support of his defense program prevented the passage of a 10-year arms elimination treaty and left both men seemingly dejected. The summit, however, was the first deep dialogue between the two powers about nuclear missile elimination.
The argument over SDI, which initially Gorbachev and the Soviets were very afraid of, is what in a way opened up a new level of dialogue between the two countries. And that new level of dialogue led to a change in history, changed the history of the world.
At the Washington summit in the December that followed, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty that eliminated intermediate-range nuclear forces, the first definitive breakthrough in arms reduction that the two men had met. The next year, Reagan visited Moscow, where he gave speeches and promoted freedom and liberal thinking in the Soviet Union.
Your generation is living in one of the most exciting, hopeful times in Soviet history.
This, combined with Gorbachev's glasnost policy, allowed the people to recognize the failing economy and the atrocities of the past, as well as the benefits of a free society. The effects were irreversible. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall was torn down, and by 1990 the Soviet satellite states were beginning to assert their independence. While it would be a mistake to claim that Ronald Reagan single-handedly ended the Cold War, it is nearly impossible to claim that it would have come when it did after another 8 years of détente. The harsh stand he took against communism pressed the Soviet Union to break from its own history. Mikhail Gorbachev was selected as a result, becoming the first communist leader Reagan believed he could trust. Reagan himself broke from what had been established Cold War policy in order to make his stand against communism.
And so I think that his great contribution is being seen. He was a guy who would roll the dice, and it worked.
The icy struggle that had bound the world for almost a half-century had ended at the feet of the stand taken by Ronald Reagan through his word and deed.